Hi, listeners. Welcome to Grief Out Loud. Remember the last time you tried to talk about grief and suddenly everybody left the room? Grief Out Loud is opening up this often avoided conversation because grief is hard enough without having to go through it alone. We bring you a mix of personal stories, tips for supporting children, teens, and yourself, and interviews with professionals in the grief world. Platitude and cliche-free, we promise. Grief Out Loud is hosted by me, Jana DeCristofaro, and produced by Dougie Center, the National Grief Center for Children and Families in Portland, Oregon. If you've been living with grief for a while now, have you ever felt yourself feeling nostalgic for the early days? Your immediate response might be, absolutely not, no way. You might even find yourself using stronger language to communicate that hard no. For some, though, there can be a wish to feel some aspects of that early grief again. A time when they felt the closest to their person, when the emotions were so intense and all-encompassing, when people were reaching out every day, when, depending on your situation, you may have lived in a bit of a liminal space, in between the world you shared with your person and the world that would come after. Please don't hear this as a glowing review of grief. But for today's guest, Jeff Porter, the hours and days and weeks after Claire, his beloved wife of 25 years, died of an aneurysm, were a time of altered perception. A time that he knew was limited but meaningful. During this time, Jeff started writing what would become his memoir, Planet Claire, Suite for Cello and Sad-Eyed Lovers. Jeff and I talk about why he and Claire, who were really opposite in some ways, were such a great match, about the big nothing he faced in living without Claire, and about what it meant for him to normalize in grief. Jeff, thank you so much for joining me for Grief Out Loud.
Well, thanks for talking with me. I'm looking forward to this.
So tell us a little bit about your wife, Claire. What was it about her that made her such a good match for you for the over 25 years that you were together?
Well, Claire and I were really quite different people, and so it was a bit of a surprise that we evolved this really tight relationship. We had a very deep intuitive connection. We understood things about one another and also about the world in an unstated kind of way, and that's sort of unique. And so we didn't have to really talk that much, but we understood what one another was thinking, and that made for a rich kind of companionship. So the more time we spent together, the greater the sense of belonging, and I really like that. That sense that Claire was home, and that I, would like to think that I was home for her too. Of course, and that's what, when you lose someone like that, that's part of the shock and the pain is you lose that sense of home. Claire was also a very grounded person. She was a really classy scholar. She's a medieval scholar, and she was quite good at her job, and she was an excellent college teacher. And she was very well grounded, much more than me. So I felt somewhat free to sort of chase my imaginings, and I often would. And I really, not before being with her, I do that, because then I'd sense that, well, I could get lost doing this or get in trouble letting my imagination go. But with Claire, I could I grew to sort of let my imagination go, and I could always count on her to reel me back in when I wandered too far. That was kind of precious. And I think if I could speak for her, I think from her point of view, she understood she was a very cautious woman, very responsible, cautious woman, and I wasn't. And so I I think she liked being with someone who was, less so, who was a little wild and liked taking risks. I'm not that way now, unfortunately, but back when we were first together, I was pretty wild. Well, I wasn't a bad boy by any means, but I was fairly wild, and I think she liked that. It's a cliche, we complemented each other well, but the actual experience of that is so much more profound. We we had this bond that was based on this kind of unstated way of knowing one another and the world together, and we shared this great sense of irony, which is I took it for granted back then, but I don't think you can. I don't think I should anymore. And so, we had this great sort of originary story together. We before we got married, we bought a TV, and I think this is in the book. It's a story about watching Twin Peaks together, and it's kind of it's a pretty amusing allegory of actually making a commitment before we could actually really think about getting married. We bought a big TV together, and and this was back in the day when the TVs were really, really kind of large. They weren't flat, and neither of us had watched TV in ages. So, we pretty much just bought books, read books, took walks, and that sort of thing. And suddenly we were thinking about bringing a TV into our small apartment. And we lived in separate apartments, and I bought the TV, and we bought the TV together, which was very, very scary. We were in a big box store. We had never done that before. And so we did this. It was the first thing we ever bought together. And we bought it for the sole purpose of watching the debut of Twin Peaks. And the experience of watching Twin Peaks together was such a kind of confirmation of that deep intuitive connection we had, and that also that sense of irony that kind of bound us together.
It's interesting to me, Jeff, because you talked about how the relationship with you and Claire, there was such a deep understanding, such an intuitive understanding that you didn't need to always express yourselves verbally to understand one another. And then you've written in the book Planet Claire that when Claire, had the brain aneurysm and was in the hospital, and then also after she died, that you talked to her constantly. And that's just an interesting dichotomy to me.
Yeah, right. So I mean, we didn't do that. We didn't do that kind of talking in life. It was pretty kind of practical. What should we eat tonight? And do you want to go see a movie? Our discourse was really, really kind of practical, and you wouldn't think for a couple of academic types who were traveling really far and wide in their work, they would be so, how should I say it, uncolorful,
Mundane, very
domestically.
mundane.
Yeah, very, very mundane. And so this happened it was not a literary gesture on my part when I began talking to her. It was, I was panicking, I was in terror. And so it just came out, and then I never stopped. And I think that, the loss of that intuitive partner required this sort of outreach on my part. And so I had to speak out now because, my intuitive partner was no longer there, and I had to fill in that empty space with my babble.
And Jeff, I know you and Claire had been on a vacation, and you returned from vacation, and then she has this brain aneurysm, and the aneurysm and the death were so sudden. And I wonder, what did the suddenness of that mean for you?
Well, it's kind of like, it's being hit by a train. I'm honestly, I really did feel like I was destroyed by something large and fast. The way a train is unstoppable and it comes really, really fast. It was so unimaginably disruptive. I mean, my life was turned upside down. And the fact that I wasn't given a chance to build a place in my mind where I could prepare for the loss of Claire was really the thing that was so kind of disruptive. If your partner goes into hospice, or if your partner has some kind of long illness, which is probably not the only way to die, but it happens quite often. You build a place inside of your mind and your heart where you do your exercises to prepare for the loss of your partner. And so there was no preparation for this. And so her death was so radical. I had to rethink everything I knew, everything that, I mean, it just went out the window. I mean, it sounds Shakespearean, but when that happens, Shakespeare becomes very, very true and very, very relevant. Everything I knew just didn't work anymore. And I had to rethink everything. And it's, I think, partly why I wrote Planet Claire, is I had to rethink things.
Mm. In the conversations I've had with people who, have had someone die very suddenly, unexpectedly, and had someone die after a long illness, that sense that nothing works anymore seems to hold true for many people. And I wonder, some of the folks I've talked to when they've had a long period of time of perhaps, I appreciate that image of like building a place in their mind where they think they're going to have to go one day. And then so much of their life has been wrapped up in caring for this person that once they die, they have to rework their entire identity and purpose. And like, how do I do the day now with this person's absence? So yeah, just an interesting reflection for me over the years of the difference in what it's like to have someone die suddenly or after a long-term illness, and then how so much of the reaction once they have died can feel very similar. You wrote in the book about how grief really altered your state of mind, that part of you left in a way. And I just wonder if you could describe that for us.
I think that the book in a way is both a means of trying to come to terms with grief and understanding it. I mean, the grief was very, very interesting. I could feel it grow inside of me. It was almost like a science fiction event.
Mm.
I could feel something inside of me. I mean, it was kind of it was sort of an immaterial thing, but sometimes it felt like it was much more material. I could feel it making sounds. I could feel it moving around. It could change shape. And there's throughout the book, I explore some different images and metaphors for this sense of grief. I think when anyone grieves, the first thing they do is they realize that they're interfacing with death, with the loss of their partner, through grief, and it's kind of like an operating system that doesn't make any sense, and it never really does. I can't say, having written the book and having felt some sense of fulfillment in understanding my relationship to grief and death, I can still say that I don't understand grief
Mm.
and I don't understand death, but I'm still alive to tell the tale. And so it was my way of interfacing with Claire and with her departure was grief, but it was an operating system, to use that metaphor, that I didn't quite understand, and so people who are grieving become very resourceful and find ways to understand that operating system. For writers, you've got to write. And so the book for me is one way of understanding the operating system so I could manage it. And I think that's what led me, once I began understanding a little bit about the operating system, I understood that, this sense of this rupture inside of my own personality was taking place. And I don't think I would have seen that or explored that had I not really sensed this was how grief was expressing itself to me, or how grief was affecting me. And so, I just did feel like once I kind of got closer to grief, that a part of me really did vacate the scene in a hurry. It did it in a hurry, and I did see it as a younger kind of self. And I don't know exactly how to make sense of that younger self. Is this the self that sort of sat on the sidelines as I evolved into a more adult-like person, thanks to being in a marriage with Claire? Or is this part of myself that was encouraged by Claire being so grounded to be a little more childlike? I'm not really sure. But there was a part of myself that really took off. And the only thing that was sure to me was that it was a younger version, and that this younger version was a little less responsible, and it didn't want to kind of do what grief wanted it to do, which
Mm.
is to kind of sit down and take account of oneself, take account of what's been lost, take account of the past, what was gained, where are you, and what does it mean to be a human being once you factor in the reality of death and loss and all that kind of stuff. So the kid who's called Space Boy doesn't have to do that. Space Boy's challenge is just to kind of zip around in outer space and go looking for Claire in some other galaxy. He finds out later, in the book, that comes with its own problems, but he's a part of me that doesn't want to do what I'm doing, grieving.
So it's like by day having to be this responsible adult taking, as you put it, like an accounting of losses, and then by writing this other part of you that can live outside of that responsibility, I guess, in a way. And
Right. Yeah.
when you were talking about like, even after writing the book and years going by, like still not understanding grief and not understanding death. And I sometimes wonder if the process is really about maybe this inkling or this urge to understand grief. And in the end, it ends up being learning to understand ourselves in grief. Like that's the knowable part, or at least the aspirational knowing part. And that to truly know grief or to truly know death or understand either those two things, maybe not possible in any way.
Yeah, I would certainly agree. And, you're in a position to kind of know quite a bit about grief. Having talked to so many people, but my own experience would certainly agree with how you put that. Being in grief is really what this book is about. It's being in grief, and being in grief requires a reckoning, but also a remembering. And I think that, I'm guessing that a lot of folks you've talked to talk about talk about their past. There is a remembering, and then there is kind of a reckoning. And I don't think you can have one without the other. And then, there is, for me, there was kind of an acceptance. I never did have that Job-like feeling. I didn't want to rage at the universe because I really couldn't point my finger at any one particular entity and said, you're responsible and I'm going to rage at you for what's happened. I mean, death, what we call death is unknowable. And how can you rage at death? And so my experience of grief was to understand how to form some preliminary sense of acceptance that would not discount either the loss or the transformation that was taking place inside of me, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I love what you said about reckoning and remembering, because I think about that, those two processes happening parallel, sometimes overlapping, interweaving, and that for many folks, particularly at the beginning, the reckoning is so painful that it almost occludes or blocks the remembering. And that for many people, there's a process over time as they maybe acclimate to the reckoning that the remembering can come back online as well. So I hadn't thought about it from those two terms before. So I really appreciate that.
Yeah, that's interesting. I sort of, because I'm something of a memoirist, it was easier for me to begin with the remembering and then use that as a base for trying to reckon. And I mean, the reckoning takes place later in the book. Once the remembering has filled the page and assumed some kind of order for readers.
Yeah, let's talk about the book itself. I mean, you have authored many books, and then this book is memoir-esque, but also very different than the other books that you've written. And you've already talked a little bit about how the writing was part of your process, but wondering what it was like to bring grief kind of into your work and your work into grief.
Sure. Yeah. Big difference. I think in the other books, I was flirting with either historical or cultural or intellectual ideas and problems and topics. And so, the writing kind of took place in a safe space inside of my head. The idea of being in control was never in question. And so there is that. There's a limitation to that kind of writing because the writer sees as his or her challenge is to establish control over very complicated material and then reach some insights. So that was sort of the normal model that lots of folks who kind of do creative writing inside of an academic situation will follow. And this was completely different because I had no control, and I didn't mind not having any control over what was happening. And in fact, the loss of control was something that really, really intrigued me as I was writing, and I did my best to allow that loss of control, which is the reality of my experience having lost so abruptly my partner, to let that play out, because I think that for readers that's kind of an important part of grieving, is to fall apart, really, to try to make sense of that, not just simply to deny it or to resist it, or try to medicate yourself out of it, but to actually let it happen and then try to make some sense of the falling apart. And again, the kind of the split self is a part of that larger process of falling apart. So that was, that was pretty new, and I really, I'll be honest with you, I like that. I was very intrigued by that. And I tried to make that as authentic as possible throughout the book.
Mm. As you're describing this, I was thinking back to earlier in our conversation where you said that you and Claire were such a good complementary match for one another because you had more of the wild side, the less reserved, less controlled side, and that this experience with grief being so out of control, almost as though you had a little bit of an imprint of what is it like to exist in an uncontrolled, maybe more wild
Yes.
environment.
To
Not
be
that you were built
clareless.
for grief, but
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Right. So, yeah, you could say that there was kind of coming face to face with my true self.
speaking of Claire, what do you think she would think of how you navigated the grief of her death?
Boy, I hate speaking for her. I'd like to think that she was relieved. I think that if she was watching, I think her greatest fear would be that I would be overwhelmed and fall into despair. And I say that because if I if I were to put her shoes on, and I was in that other place, looking not down, but looking at Claire in this place on this plane, that would be my great fear, is that she would fall into a crushing kind of despair. And it was certainly, it's possible, and it's a little seductive to fall into despair. And it was helpful to be writing a book, and that because the book doesn't give you time to indulge that sort of dark state of mind. But the big nothing that you face when you lose your partner and you're really looking at death is really terrifying. And it seems to me a logical response to that big nothing. The terrible nothing is despair. And so I think she probably was really, really worried, frightened that I would fall into despair and maybe never climb out.
So when I think about people who have had someone who was part of their daily life die, Claire, your partner that you had been together for over 25 years, and that the daily routine can be so disrupted, and wonder, what was that like early on versus now? Like, how have you adapted your daily routine?
Oh, it's so terrible. We how successful and effective we human beings are at normalizing ourselves. And so now I look back almost nostalgically, believe it or not. And I mean, I was pretty much, the grief did this, then put me in an alternative state of mind. And I was very aware of that and kind of keen on making, registering the world from the point of view as someone who's been turned upside down. Because, after a year, it stops and you begin to normalize yourself. And I'm fully renormalized. And that's just the way we are as human creatures. The grief is there. It never goes away. And it's always changing. But during the first year, the grief is so powerful. It really does alter the way that you experience other people, the way that you experience the world. And so I was really kind of fascinated by that. I did sense that I didn't have too much time to kind of record what it's like to see the world through the eyes of someone who is grieving as deeply as I was back then. And again, that's partly why the book got written, was to find a place for these perceptions, what I saw, because I wouldn't be like that, and unless I lose another person. And then you normalize yourself, and you can't do that anymore. Then you're just kind of like, you see the world the way that everyone else sees it. You can't take it for granted. I mean, there's early moments for grief, or I mean, this sounds terrible, but they are kind of precious, because you are in a place in your mind and your heart where you'll never go again. It's like someone taking you to another planet and leaving you there for 6 weeks, and then they pick you up and they bring you back, and then what you saw, you'll never see again. You'll just You see some sunshine in October, and you'll see some rain in April, but you won't see those weird starscapes. You won't see the weird moon dust or whatever else is on that strange planet. So yeah, and I kind of missed that. I didn't expect that, but that was something I was kind of keenly aware of as I was trying to figure out how to operate this strange system called grief.
I just got a little bit of goosebumps listening to this because I have heard many people talk about almost that nostalgia for the early days of grief, but from a very different lens of a fear that the further they get from the intensity and the rawness of those initial weeks and days and months, the further they feel from their person. And that is a new, like a whole other level of grief. I hadn't heard about it or thought about it in this way that those early days, we're so altered. Our perceptions are altered. Things are heightened in a way of, yeah, of actually like appreciating what that meant for us and how we are existing in the world and seeing the world. And it almost reminds me, because I've been having this weird sort of guilt nostalgia for the early days of the pandemic, back when we didn't know anything, but there was so much like, we got to figure this out and we got to, everything was just so heightened and everything was new and everything
Right,
felt
that's true.
different and
Yeah.
creative and innovative. And now that we're just in like boring old pandemic life, like blah, yeah, here's how we do it now. I was like, what's wrong with me? I feel a little like, oh, a little reminiscent of those days of like, wow, we figured so much out in 2.5 weeks. And so thank you for the permission to maybe have a bit of that nostalgia. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, that's curious. I think, it's a physicist, Carlo Rovoli, who just wrote this book on time that was, I think, a bestseller, and it's really interesting. And he talks a lot about entropy and the importance of low entropy. Low entropy is what kind of creates the possibility for order and meaning, and really creates the possibility for time, even though it's not a universal or an absolute constant. And so low entropy would be those early moments in the pandemic, or those early moments when you're grieving, where you begin to organize what you're feeling and what you're thinking. And I mean, the process of writing a book, or, if you're writing a journal, or if you're writing letters to your family, where you're trying to deal with your grief, all of those efforts are going to transform the low entropy into a higher entropy. And when that happens, there's a loss. There's a loss of the signal as information, people would say. I'm not sure if that makes any sense, but there is kind of like pure meaning, kind of experiences, maybe more unique. It feels more original when you're in that low entropy state. And we're doomed to kind of transforming those low entropy states into high entropy states. That's the unfortunate way of the world.
The inevitability of it.
Yeah.
Well, Jeff, I feel like we just had a little bit of a hype conversation about grief. So, listeners out there, in no way are we saying like, yay, grief, but just to really appreciate how much it radically shifts who we are and our way of being in the world and the way we see things, the way we hear things, the way we feel things. And it reminds me too that I've interviewed other authors on the podcast who have written books about their grief. And there's like two categories. Those of you who wrote the book in the moment as it was unfolding, the notes and the journaling are happening right then. And then folks who write the book years later as a reflective piece of looking back upon something. And so I've really appreciated that both of those types of memoirs and novels and other types of book exist, because I think for some folks to be able to touch into like, this is what it feels like as it's unfolding versus this is what it looks like and feels like with a bit of distance and buffer. So thank you for harnessing all that what was happening in the moment to share that with me and with other folks who will have the opportunity to read Planet Claire. And in that realm, how can people find the book if they want to connect with you and your other work?
Let's see. The book is in the usual places. You can find it, of course, on Amazon. The publisher has got a nice discount on the book at Akashic Books, so you can easily find it there. think there's Indie Bookstore. I think you can find the book there as well. I have a website, a lowercase Jeff hyphen Porter at .com. And there's a list of my books, descriptions of my books, and ways to kind of get my books there too. Also, stuff I make. I I work with film and sound, and so I have some sound pieces and some films on the website as well. There's a way of contacting me on that website, so those are useful venues.
Well, thank you for outlining those. And listeners, as always, they'll be in the show notes. You can just click a link. You don't have to scurry to write things down right now. Well, Jeff, thank you. I mean, it was an honor to read your book and just really appreciating our time together and sort of winding through some different aspects of grief that I wasn't even expecting to talk about today. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Jana, for talking to me and being interested in the topic. I really enjoyed the conversation.
And listeners out there, I say it each and every time, but thank you for being part of our community. The show would not mean anything if you weren't out there tuning in and listening. So please share the show with those that you think might be supported by it. If you want to reach out to me, you can email me at griefoutloud@dougy, DOUGY.org. That website, DOUGY.org, is also the best place to learn more about Dougy Center, to access all of our free resources, including all of our past episodes. So thanks again for listening, and we hope you'll join us again next time.